Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. It is our Friday weekend edition, and sitting across the table from me is Dr. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation. If you have heard his voice today in the Dallas area, it's because he's been doing quite a bit of radio, but he decided to join us for 3 hours today. So, Dr. Merrill Matthews, always great to have you here.
I'm glad to be here, Kerby.
And again, one of the reasons is he has a new book out, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. America Faces the Entitlements Cliff. And so, of course, since our issue this month on our Outlook magazines on the national debt and entitlements, we'll certainly get into that. But I thought before we do that, and we'll probably postpone that till the next hour, because then Keisha Russel with First Liberty will join us as well. We have a couple of other articles we've posted, one on the Electoral College, one on Equal Pay Day, and a couple of others. But Dr. Merrill Matthews, let's start out with the economy. Almost everybody was saying, well, we're going to probably go into a recession. After all, the things are going to sputter pretty quickly. The high sugar reaction, if you will, to the tax cuts is going to fade, and 3.2% gross domestic product, GDP.
Yes, that's their first estimate. They do three estimates over time.
Of course, yeah.
That's their first
Sometimes
one. They usually
revise it up or down.
Sometimes it goes up or down, but it was amazing large number given all the challenges we had in the first quarter and in the last quarter of last year, which sort of carried over into the first quarter. So we're back to the things of economists have predicted 15 of the last two recessions.
I've used that phrase more than once, and it is really the case. And again, I won't do what I know Rush Limbaugh did and a few others just a while ago, and that is just playing clip after clip after clip where everybody's making those predictions. And we're not just talking about CNN or MSNBC. I mean, they even had one clip from Fox News. I think everybody just said, well, you know, you get a sugar high from tax cuts, but after about a year or so, that kind of wears off. Not necessarily, because it's not just the tax cuts, but it's also reduction in various kinds of regulations. It's the possibility, maybe, of some kind of agreement between the United States and China. What about that?
Right, yes. The South China Post is reporting this morning that they think that President Xi from China and President Trump will announce that they're going to have some kind of agreement coming up, signing agreement in June. Now, I haven't seen anybody else cover that, so I don't know if the South China Post, which is based in Hong Kong, is accurate on that. But we've been hearing for the past 2 or 3 weeks that they think that sometime in May or early June they'll be able to come to an agreement on that, and I hope they do. This has been this trade war is a little over a year old, and that has been a drag on the economy in and of itself. If we had not been doing that, I suspect we would be even a much more robust GDP numbers.
You know, and let's talk about just for a second why those numbers at 3.2% are very high in light of, because you said, you know, first of all, of course, the issue of a trade war. At least a partial government shutdown, right? That might have had some impact,
right?
As well as a couple of other kind of issues. So in some respects, in the midst of what I think reasonably could be seen as some things that would have driven the GDP down, it popped up anyway.
Many of the economies are slowing down, especially in Europe.
Sure.
The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund keep revising down their projections for the year. So it doesn't look good for many of them. Even Germany has got a very low GDP this time around. So it's not looking good for Europe. China has been slowing for a while as well. Now, to some extent, as an economy gets bigger and bigger, you expect that to slow, but it's slowed more than some people had anticipated, in large part, I think, because of some of the trade challenges and so forth. So those things are happening, and the U.S. economy drives the world.
Right.
If I've gone back and looked at this, if we go into a recession, nearly everybody else goes into a recession. Mm-hmm. If they go into a recession and we have the right policies, we can oftentimes survive a recession, and that seems to be what we're doing right now.
And again, the vice president and now the president are speaking at the National Rifle Association. Mm-hmm. I got a feeling he'll be crowing a little bit about the GDP. As a matter of fact, just before he left on what used to be called Andrews Air Force Base, now we have to get used to the fact that it's a joint base, Andrews. I like the old name better, but I understand why, because they have Marines and Air Force and everybody together. He was making some very dramatic statements about 3.2% of the best economy and no close seconds is what he was saying.
And there's things going on behind the scenes. The Council of the business conference that does the leading economic indicators, they usually release that around the 18th to the 20th of the month. I looked at it here a few days ago, and it went up a fairly good upturn for this past month, which had been sort of going sideways for a while. And interestingly, CEO business conference confidence was up as well. Now, consumer confidence is still down in that, but you'd expect that. Consumers tend to lag the CEOs. If they see things happening and they're seeing orders pick up and so forth, they start thinking, things are looking better. So CEO confidence is up, and the leading economic indicators were up as well. So those are both good signs.
I would think so. Let's talk about Stephen Moore for just a minute, because you know him as well. First of all, let's give him credit. He was the author of the book Trumponomics. Mm-hmm. And I remember Ronald Reagan say, I knew that my economic plan was working when they no longer made the disparaging comments about Reaganomics, and the same thing, just the fact that he came up with the phrase Trumponomics. But I understand that he was supposed to be on the Federal Reserve Board, but he's made a few statements a long time ago that maybe are causing a problem.
One of the problems when you've been a commentator for as long as he has is you're liable to say something at some point in time, even if it's 20 or 30 years ago, that they will find, and that's what's hitting him. Steve has a couple of challenges. Number one, he's seen as too much in Trump's camp.
Right.
So that's considered a challenge. In addition, he's not a monetary expert. I mean, he does have a master's in economics, and that's good, but he's not a monetary expert, and he knows that, and said he has a learning curve to go in that. On the other hand, the governors of the Fed have often been a little bit staid, and they miss their projections a lot.
Yes,
they do a lot of wrong things. So having a new voice, if you're gonna stir things up, putting Steve on the Fed Board of Governors is a way to stir him up, and probably for good.
Yes. Well, we've had him on the program. Of course, you've had him at various luncheons, and we both know him. And the other day when Nick Pitts comes in and says, "Have you heard the latest on Steve Moore?" I said, "No, I almost hate to think," because like you said, when you've done but again, some of the comments had nothing to do with economics.
Yes.
Stick to your basics and you won't get in trouble, maybe. So anyway, it's just kind of something I would mention. But when we come back from the break, since we're talking about money, let's talk about the equal pay day and other meaningless tropes. And I even wrote one called Equal Death Day because it reminds us of that. And then we'll get into the Electoral College dishonesty, as well as, the whole issue of the tyranny of the majority. And these are all very good articles by Dr. Merrill Matthews. So if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read them, first of all, we've put them on our website, pointofview.net, but you can also go to ipi.org. And if you'd like to hear all the interviews he's done over the last couple of weeks, those are all there as well. They're very nice about you getting all those interviews posted, so you can learn a little bit more about some of the things that you've been addressing. And the co-author of this book, America Faces the Entitlements Cliff. We'll get to that a little bit later so that our entire audience can hear it. But if you'd like to join the conversation at any point, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and learn a little bit more from some of the very good writing by Dr. Merrill Matthews. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, funerals are starting to look very different. An article in the Washington Post predicts that the funerals as we know it is becoming a relic. And so many of our time-honored rituals are being set aside. You know, one of the first books I wrote was on the subject of death and dying. Back then, I noted that we were a death-denying culture. The elderly used to die in our homes, but now we're dying in hospitals and care facilities. And so we tried to cover the reality of death with euphemisms like, he passed on, or she's in a better place. Well, 4 decades later, we see that our secular society is changing the rules about dying. Americans are less likely to spend as much money on somber, embalmed body funerals. Cost is another part of the reason, which may also explain why more than half of all American deaths lead to cremations. This is nearly double the percentage less than 2 decades ago. Now, some of the changes in funerals parallel other changes in major life events. There are more destination weddings than just a few decades ago. Some of these gender reveal celebrations are becoming theatrical productions, so we shouldn't be surprised that some funerals look more like retirement parties or even birthday parties. Concern about the environment probably explains why many are opting for green funerals. The body is placed in a biodegradable coffin or shroud. One state has approved legislation that allows for human composting, and there are even businesses to turn one's ashes into vinyl or jewelry. Each generation tries to make its peace with the inevitability of death, and we are seeing new trends in that regard. As Christians, we can take comfort that we will be raised from the dead just as Christ was raised from the dead, and we know that death will be the final enemy to be destroyed. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, now playing.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us today, and his article on Equal Pay Day. First of all, let me explain that. And the argument is that we are in the month of April, and just recently we passed what was called Equal Pay Day. And the argument is that because men are paid so much more than women, a woman, in order to catch up to a man's pay, not only has to get everything she gets in 2018, but work all the way into 2019 till April to catch up. And so it's kind of the idea of equal pay. And I did a commentary a while back in which I then talked about someone else talking about the idea of equal death day, because when you talk about the difference in pay, there are a lot of choices, Dr. Merrill Matthews, between, for example, individuals that want to go into high-paying jobs, but sometimes they're fairly dangerous, or women, as we have found in many cases, value flexibility because they're taking care of children and those kinds of things. So you actually took on this idea of equal pay day. Tell us a little bit more.
Well, when we hear that women make, say, 79 cents for every dollar a man makes, and that varies a little bit. In fact, there was just a new study out this week that for looking just at Texas and saying that women made 81 cents for every dollar a man makes. But what they're doing is that they're taking all men and all women with no distinctions about education, job, or anything else, and they look at what their average income is, and that's where you get the disparity. And it just... You talk about fake news. This is fake economics because it doesn't take into consideration any differences. So men tend to go into STEM careers, engineering especially. Historically, they went into medical professions like doctors and so forth. That's been rising for women. But women typically went into humanities, education, and other things. And so if you took a group of women and you took a group of men, you were likely that the men would be in higher paying careers than women, not because of any discrimination, but because they just chose different types of careers. And that's where nearly all of the difference comes in. I mean, any serious economist will look at this and say, there may be a 1% or 2% percentage points difference in there when you take out all the other factors. But by and large, almost all of this is just different careers, different types of career paths, because, as you say, people want to have, women sometimes want to have jobs with more flexibility and things like that. That tends not to be the CEO and other things where people have to be there. And that just happens to be the case. It is not economic discrimination. We've got laws against that.
That's right. Well, and when you mentioned STEM, I thought I would use the illustration that I love to use about my niece, because she is the only and was the only white woman in the engineering class. First of all, she was one of the few whites in the class, and certainly the only woman and who was also white in the class.
Yes.
So, and so they sort of looked at her like she was a unicorn, because the bottom line is that if you went into those fields, and then she ended up working in Nokia, and she was highly valuable, because if you're looking for diversity, she fit the category pretty quickly, because the diversity was going the other way. It was usually Indian students, Chinese students, and you're not talking about predominantly male. You're talking about almost exclusively male. They were looking for women, and so obviously she goes into a very high-paying job as an engineer, which would have been very different if she had decided instead to be a primary school teacher or something like that.
And let me second that. My experience is that corporations are dying to get well-qualified women who can do the job in those high-paying jobs. I know a woman right now. She was doing very well, making a lot of money. They sent her over to Singapore. She's doing very well there, making even a lot more money. And she may be coming back to make even more money, because the corporations, if you can do a good job, they want women in those high-paying leadership roles.
Well, again, this gets back to the fact that we're in the midst of an election cycle, and Elizabeth Warren and people like that like to simply talk about the so-called gender pay gap. But it does seem to me that I've seen some pretty significant studies, one that was interestingly done of those individuals that drive buses and things of that nature, where because you could not even do anything that would look even slightly like discrimination, they still found that, guess what? The women were less likely to take various routes after hours or over the weekend. So flexibility was really important, because they had to raise their kids. They also were less likely to take routes that would take them into maybe a more dangerous area of town. Those are lifestyle choices. And then back to the one that I mentioned just a minute ago, because this appeared in the Wall Street Journal, in which, again, they found, interestingly enough, by the work of Mark Perry, who's at the American Enterprise Institute. Right. I followed him over the years.
Very good.
Very good. And he points out that if you look at these dangerous jobs, I'll list just a few. Fishery workers is up at the top of the list. That's almost mostly men. Lumberjacks, 98% male. Haven't seen many lumberjills lately. Aircraft pilots, well, that's a little different, but still it's 94% male when you add not just the airlines but everything else. Right now, since those of us in Texas have just had hailstorms, roofers, 99% male.
Yes.
I can't even think of the last time I've seen a woman on a roof. And you and I both have been on a roof, so you know why that's the case.
And on the other hand, if you would go to some daycare centers or senior care centers or so forth, you tend to see those predominantly women. That's choices that they make, and those jobs are going to probably pay significantly less than if you're on construction and other things for less educated people.
So again, one of the reasons I wanted to focus on this is not only does it help us understand what's going on, this is going to be a campaign issue. I mean, you know as well as I do that if you look at the previous platforms, at least for the Democratic Party, they talk about gender pay, equity, all sorts of things. You're going to hear this time and time again. But as you point out, we have a couple of pieces of legislation. In 1963, we passed the Equal Pay Act. And then a little bit later, we're going to talk about the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so if indeed you can show discrimination, where individuals with the same seniority, the same qualifications are paid less, the EEOC will take you on very quickly, won't they?
Right. And so we don't want to deny that it doesn't go on at all. It's just, I think, a very, very small part of the economy that someone actually does that, both because of the laws and the challenges that they would have, and because it's just people, most companies want to have minorities and women and others that can do a good job.
Yeah. And so, again, I just wanted you to see this article that you have posted, and it came out earlier this month. And if you are interested at all in the pay gap, and this is probably highly risky because usually it's better to have a Penna Dexter or even a Keisha Russel talk about this, because two guys talking about women not getting enough pay probably gets us in a little bit of trouble. But let's also move on to one of the other articles that you've posted, and that is the Electoral College, because not only will we see in the campaign this idea of pay equity, you have more and more individuals that are simply arguing that we have to get rid of the Electoral College.
Yes, there have been several proposals out there that we need to get rid of it and move to a popular vote for the president, for the presidential election. This is engendered almost entirely because Democrats lost the 2000 and the 2016 elections, even though they got a small percentage of additional votes. So the Electoral College was set up by the founders as a way to try to minimize the potential for the tyranny of the majority. Some states were going to have less populations than other states, and those states wanted to make sure that they had at least a bit more of a thumb on the scales isn't quite the right term, because that sounds a little bit pejorative, but they wanted to have a little bit of an extra bump because they're small states. And of course, this is only 13 states at the initial. Nobody knew about California. Nobody knew about Texas, the large states that were going to be there. They just wanted to make sure that they had a little bit bigger voice than what their population was, and that's what the Electoral College was intended to do.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to take on, because I earlier in the week take on two issues. Number one, this idea of the National Popular Vote Initiative, where you have more and more states are trying to figure out an end run around the Electoral College, recognizing that the chances of getting both the House and the Senate to propose an amendment to change the Electoral College and then to get enough state legislatures to actually ratify that are slim and none. So they're actually coming up with a different idea. But then also, earlier in the week, I took on this issue of whether or not the Electoral College is actually implemented so that it could advance slavery. And, of course, one of the beneficiaries of that was a large state like Virginia compared to a small state like Rhode Island. But I think you can set that aside as well. So we'll get into that a little bit more. And if you've always wondered what would it be like if we did not have an Electoral College, earlier in the week, about 3 days ago, in addition to my commentary, we have this little picture, and you show this outsized California, outsized Texas, Florida, and New York, and then these little small bitty states around that, and it gives you a real good idea that very quickly those states, or then if you look at those cities, and we have one of those maps as well, you could take all of those cities and put them in the area of Los Angeles, and those individuals in those small areas could actually elect the next president. That doesn't seem right. And so we'll get into some of that with Dr. Merrill Matthews. And if you have some thoughts about it, feel free to give us a call. But if not, sit back and learn a little bit more about American history. All that coming up right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of view can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Dr. Merrill Matthews with us today, and we are talking about, at the moment, the Electoral College. And I wanted to go into this in a little more detail, if for no other reason, to hear both sides. Because, Dr. Matthews, this was kind of a point-counterpoint. This was from the Los Angeles Times. So, if nothing else, maybe I'll try to give the other side a little bit, and you can respond. But it is important because this is going to be a big campaign issue for a variety of reasons. And that is, I thought it was going to be a big issue in 2001, 2002, simply because Al Gore lost. But that didn't really manifest itself, but it certainly has now, because you have the National Popular Vote Compact, which basically is, in theory, we have a number of states, the most recent one, Connecticut, saying that once the states reach a threshold of 270 electoral votes, which is kind of the magic number,
right,
then all those states that have actually passed this will ignore the vote of their states and vote for the popular vote. So in many cases, they're blue states, so it probably wouldn't have affected the election even with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. But just imagine, let's take Connecticut, for example. I lived in Connecticut. It's a blue state, and yet let's assume that indeed the blue state in this particular case voted for, as you might imagine, a Democrat. And yet they are going to say that even if a Republican gets a smaller number of votes, we'll still vote for the popular vote rather than how our individuals vote. Or let's take a Georgia, for example. Even if a lot of those individuals would vote for the Republican, even if the popular vote went for a Democrat, then they would disavow the votes of all the people in the state of Georgia and send electors to Atlanta to vote for the Democrats.
Right. So it's a way to bypass to change the electoral college. You need a constitutional amendment.
That's not going to happen.
And that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So this is their way to bypass it by having the states just agree that they will that whoever wins the popular vote nationally will then that state's all of its electors will vote for that person. Now, I think 13 and 14 states have already passed legislation on this.
D.C.
and Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And so that's up to 184 electoral votes. So they're not far off
pretty close
from being able to do that.
Yeah.
And if the deal is that they've passed the legislation, but it doesn't go into effect until enough states join it that would reach 270 votes, electoral votes or more. If that happens, it doesn't really make a difference about what the rest of us would think about it. Those states would all throw their electors towards whoever wins the popular vote. And I just find this bizarre. I mean, I can't imagine, because you and I live in Texas. I just can't imagine if my state voted overwhelmingly for a candidate Smith and the national popular vote went for Jones, that all my electors go and vote for Jones. It just doesn't make any sense at all to me.
Well, and again, let's explain to some of our listeners how that happens. Most of the states have a winner-take-all. You have a few, of course, was it Nebraska and Maine changed that a little bit, but by and large, they would just send a different set of electors. So instead, they would say that even if Texas voted for Republican, but the popular vote went for the Democrat, then they would take the Democrat electors to Austin and cast their votes. And so it is bizarre, because that's one of the first things that would cause you real concern, because it would disenfranchise the voters of your particular state. Now, you talk about the controversy right now with the Electoral College. Imagine if the entire state of Texas, or some other state, whatever state you want to pick, actually disenfranchised all the voters. I think there would be people going to the state capitol, taking it apart brick by brick.
And the way they structured it, the way the framers structured the Electoral College, it is meant to give a little bit of a nudge to smaller states. So, as I point out in the piece, California has the largest population in the country. It has more people than the 21 smallest states. Right. California has 55 electors, but if you put those 21 smaller states together, I think it's like at 92 electors.
Right.
So that gets you over a third the way to winning the election. So those 21 smaller states actually have a little more clout than the one state of California, even though it has the most population. And it's meant to do that so that people can go out. Candidates will say, we can't go out and ignoring all these small states. Hillary Clinton did that with some states, including Wisconsin, and you could make the case that cost her the election.
Well, again, let's talk for just a minute about what that would look like if we eventually did go to a popular vote. And it seems to me that you would see two things. First of all, Hillary Clinton would have spent a lot more time in Los Angeles and Chicago and New York. But here's the other part of it. Donald Trump would have spent more time in New York. He just ignored the state he was from because he recognized that that was just a gimme.
Right.
He didn't really go to California very much either. There's no point in campaigning in New York and California, but there is a lot of impetus to campaign in Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, and a variety of other places. True?
That's absolutely right. And so Donald Trump actually made a good decision in where he decided to campaign, and he was able to win some of those typically bluish or fairly strong blue states were able to move over because of just some of the blue collar voters and others that decided to support him. It is a very interesting that he took that strategy, and it ended up being a successful strategy. The other problem is when they say the popular vote, do they mean the majority vote? Because they typically say popular vote, but we've had a lot of presidents who've won without getting a majority.
That's
Bill
true.
Clinton never won a majority.
Never did. Yeah.
And so the Electoral College actually comes in and says, even though Bill Clinton did not win the majority, he won the majority of electoral votes, and so he's president. It's a done deal. It sort of establishes that. But if you come out as a Bill Clinton with just a popular vote, he only won, I think, 43% of the vote of the popular vote during his first election because Ross Perot was in there.
Sure.
It doesn't sound like a good, solid win if we're going that direction.
No, it doesn't. And again, one of the advantages, it gives you a sense of more momentum than you really possibly have. Now, of course, if you're Ronald Reagan, you win 49 states. That works pretty easily. But let's see, bring, just before we take a break, one other issue that I've brought up and see if I'm off target or not. But it's the issue of recount. Mm-hmm. And let's go back to 2000. We had to have a recount in the state of Florida. Remember the hanging chads and everything?
Yes.
Oh, my gosh. But if it's now the popular vote, then, or the majority vote or whatever it might be, there are a lot more potential for a long, drawn-out set of recounts, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, because you got to go. Any state could make a difference as opposed to just one state making a difference. So it creates a real problem there. Plus, if you have states that are corrupted, the Electoral College sort of bypasses that. The popular vote doesn't do that.
Yeah. And again, we recognize that getting just enough votes out of Cook County and helps elect one individual. And if you want to talk about recounts, since we're in the state of Texas, Lyndon Johnson ran against Coke Stevens.
Yes,
remember?
indeed.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
And there you had a little bit of electronic, or electoral, I should say, not electronic, electoral funny business
there
going
in South
on there.
Texas.
Yes, and so you start thinking through now these population centers could be really key. So what has happened in Philadelphia, well, it doesn't matter because you're looking at the electoral votes for the entire state of Pennsylvania. But now all of a sudden what happens in Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Georgia, whatever, of course, Dallas, Houston, those kinds of things are going to make a real difference. And if you had to do recounts in every one of those cities, that could just be disastrous.
And just going back to what the framers intended, the states created the federal government. Right. So the framers said, we're giving the states the power to determine their electors and how they're going to run that and so forth, because it was the states that created the federal government, not the other way around.
And I'm surprised with the National Popular Vote Initiative that they didn't opt for something different, and that is to say that we will actually apportion electors based on the popular vote within the state. Mm-hmm. I think
and a few states do that.
Yeah, and there are a few, and I'm surprised that they didn't do that instead, because then that might strike people as being a lot more fair than the situation which is just simply saying we're going to just have a winner take all, and we'll just determine which electors go to the state capitol based upon the popular vote.
Well, you mentioned Connecticut a minute ago. We were talking about if our state of Texas went for one and then we don't, but just for you people in Connecticut, if your state votes for somebody else and Donald Trump wins the national election, this means your state electors vote for Donald Trump. Just want you to know that.
But again, most of the states so far that have been part of this National Popular Vote Compact are blue states.
That's right.
Which I thought was kind of interesting because in some respects it won't make any difference. If this was implemented right now with Hillary Clinton, I don't think it made a difference at all.
Yeah. But to that point, if Donald Trump wins the next election under the National Popular Vote, all you blue states get to vote for Donald Trump.
Donald Trump, if indeed you get to that point. And as you point out, they need 270 electoral votes, and you figured out that we're at 184.
Yes.
But that's less than 90, and you could come up with another state or two.
You get a few
between-
more states, and you could be there.
Oh, boy, here we go. So anyway, just another issue we put on the table here, and if you are part of this conversation, love to join with us, feel free to do so. We come back, did want to get at least a couple of comments from Dr. Merrill Matthews on Joe Biden because of his announcement, and then we're going to get into this whole issue of the entitlements cliff. The new book that is out. We, by the way, have a link that we have now posted for you to find. And if you want to get a copy of the book on Kindle, it is available to you right there on the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
The Washington Post reported this. A procession of clergy dressed in white carried a simple black cross through the streets of Ile-Saint-Louis on Friday, continuing a Good Friday ritual even while the charred hulk of Notre Dame Cathedral loomed behind them. Thousands of Parisians and visitors gathered for the Stations of the Cross devotion, a symbolic reenactment of Christ's Passion that commemorates the trajectory from his sentencing to his burial in 14 stops. Human beings are moved by stories, even more so when a story involves several of the senses. The world's greatest story is told as one walks the Stations of the Cross. For centuries, this story has also been told in the structure, the stained glass, the artwork, and yes, the relics at Notre Dame. Rod Dreher points out that cathedrals were poor people's books, because even the illiterate could be taught how to read the symbolism on the glass and the stones of the cathedral. Notre Dame receives 13 million visitors a year. I went there when I was 16. To me, it was another stop on a sightseeing tour of Paris. At that age, I knew very little and, if I'm honest, cared very little about the things of God. But inside, looking up, I was drawn to think about him. Years later, as a believer, I returned. In her Wall Street Journal column, Peggy Noonan expressed the sadness people of varying faiths felt seeing the cathedral burn. In her words, destroyed beauty is a spiritual event. She called a friend, Liz Lev, who is an art historian, an expert on Catholic art. When the fire came for 2 days, we let our guard down, Ms. Lev told Ms. Noonan. It showed us that beauty still affects people, that they know they are custodians. We still need to believe in the beautiful. As we invite Christ to write our story, he makes us more like him, more beautiful. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Time for a few more minutes, and then the next hour we're going to get into all sorts of issues in the news and also talk a little bit about this issue of entitlements. Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, and in just a few minutes, Keisha Russel, First Liberty, will join us as well. But one of the things I thought we might talk about is Joe Biden. Mark Davis, you've been on the program with him before. He's been on this program with us as well. Biden announcement video takes the lowest road. Is it out of necessity? And the point he's making is that when I watched the video by Joe Biden, it came in a way that I didn't expect, because he talks about Charlottesville, Virginia, the Declaration of Independence. I thought, okay, here's almost a soaring kind of speech. And then he goes and says, and then we have, of course, the president, who actually sees those white supremacists, those neo-Nazis, and said there were fine people on both sides. And I'm thinking, oh, really? You don't know? Well, and that's the point Mark Davis is making. He does know that the fine people were referring to those who did not want Robert E. Lee's statue taken down, not those white supremacists or the neo-Nazis and others. Very clear. As a matter of fact, yesterday we even played the audio where he even condemns those individuals. But this is just like a bad penny, just keeps coming back again. It just, whether it's Sarah Palin, who said that she could see Russia from her house, which she didn't. It was Tina Fey playing her on Saturday Night Live that said that. But people have that in their head. And I bet if I took a microphone right now, Dr. Merrill Matthews, and interviewed people, they'd all say, oh, yeah, a good example of the president's racism is the fact that he referred to the white supremacists as fine people. And I think Joe Biden knows that that's not the case. But the point he says is that he took the lowest road. Is it out of necessity? What about this?
Well, Joe Biden, the man can't help himself making in many cases some very dumb statements. Remember, after Sarah Palin caught all that grief, Joe Biden went on the air and made statements like, when the Depression started, FDR went on television there when the Great Depression started to explain to everybody. And I thought, it sort of started in 29. FDR was not president until early 33.
And there was
really no television there.
And Bob, stand up, wait, again, and all those. I mean, there was like a gaffe a week from the vice president, and now he's running for the presidency.
And now he's running for the presidency, and he has run before. He apparently gave it some consideration in 1980. Pat Caddell was a close friend and encouraged him to do it. He didn't do it. 1984, he filled out the paperwork but never actually filed it. And then for the 1988 election, he actually jumped in about, I think, June of 1987. And then in September of 1987, it came about that he had lifted 5 or 6 pages from Neil Kinnock, a socialist of the member of the Labour Party in England. Now, today, he ended up ending his campaign after that came about. Today, it might actually spur his campaign to say, I've been able to quote socialists for years.
But again, the point is that he did have this, and most people thought that was it. This is a senator from Delaware, and we'll never hear from him again. But he served in there. He's had some interesting interaction with Anita Hill this week, I guess.
He did, and came back from 2000. He came back and tried the 2008 campaign. Right. But in Iowa, he just got, there was no interest at all in him in Iowa. And I don't know, but my guess is that's going to be the same case. There will probably not be any interest in him in Iowa and some of the early states, and at that point he'll have to sort of step out. He could have quit when he was ahead, but he decided not to do that.
And again, that gets back to the Wall Street Journal. Can Bernie or Biden beat Bernie? And that's the question, because right now, if you look at the polls, which mean nothing, but we'll talk about them anyway.
It's mostly name recognition right now.
Then 42% to 34% leading Dr. Donald Trump, of course. 19% undecided, but again, that's just name recognition. But the bigger issue is not whether or not you could beat Trump, because there are a fair number of Democrats that believe that Joe Biden could beat Donald Trump. The real question is whether you can win the nomination in a time when we have like a woke primary. I think it's really the odds are against any white male winning this primary, although certainly right now Bernie's dealing with those expectations in a way that most people didn't anticipate.
Yes, I think you're right, except with the exception of Bernie Sanders. Yes. I think the question is, can a white male win the Democratic primary? We just had the She the People meeting here this past week.
There's a little bit of booing, wasn't there?
There was booing there, and these people would like to see a woman of color actually take the Democratic nomination. Now, you can't... The voters are going to vote for whoever they're going to vote for, whoever excites them.
Right.
But right now, Beto O'Rourke is not being very exciting to them. Pete Buttigieg has actually gotten some. We'll see if he continues that. But Bernie Sanders sort of drives that agenda. And if you were going to say we're going to move to somebody who's a woman of color, Kamala Harris may pick that up. Maybe Elizabeth Warren slips in. It's hard to know, but there's so many that it sort of waters down most of them because you've got so many who just have a very small percentage point.
Joe Biden becomes number 20 and take a vote and split it by 20, and somebody that wins by percentage point becomes the winner, because that's the problem.
Yeah, and we're only about, 2 months away from the first Democratic debate, right?
Yes. And we've already had these town halls, one after another. And somewhere along the line, you need some specificity, since we mentioned our mayor, Pete Buttigieg, who the other day was confronted basically by a number of individuals by the fact that if you look at his website, there's no policy pronouncements. And he said, well, I just want him to get to know me first. Mm-hmm. And so, policy pronouncements are going to be, I think, really important for the mainstream dedicated grassroots Democrat voters right now, because those are the ones that turn out. There are going to be a fair number of Democrats that are going to be saying, I'm not sure I like any of them right now, but when it comes time for the general election, I'll vote for whoever it is. But right now, I'm not all that enthused by any of these individuals running.
That's probably true. When Bernie went on to Fox News 2 weeks ago,
yes,
I thought I watched most of it. I thought he did a very good job. Poor Brett didn't know some of the questions to answer. He didn't know enough about some of these things. But Bernie comes across as very knowledgeable, articulate, sympathetic. I think he's going to do well. Yes. And he's not even a Democrat.
Well, and that's what is so interesting about this, is that he isn't a Democrat. And again, he breaks the mold, because I still have had some questions as to whether or not a white male, even if he's a socialist or even if he's a homosexual, is going to be able to break through. And I also recognize that California now votes in March. For those of us that grew up in California, you vote in June. It didn't make a bit of difference in the primaries. This time they vote at the very same time as Texas, which means, first of all, the person that has money is going to be able to actually be in these major markets, in television markets, and more importantly, a senator from California maybe has some advantage, but also, of course, Bernie Sanders, who's been able to raise a lot of money, has some advantages.
And his politics is very similar to that, but Kamala Harris is from California, and she may be still popular there.
I guess what we're basically saying is you got two people that claim to be somewhat experts, and we have no idea.
Don't have a clue.
Which is why you have to do that. But again, I think we've had this feeling before when we tried to figure out who's going to be playing for the national championship in basketball, college basketball, or anything else. You play the game, and then you find out who's actually going to be the winner, and there's some real surprises along the way. And I would have to say that Bill Clinton was a big surprise back when he ran in the early 1990s.
And most experts did not think Donald Trump would do well until it was so obvious that he finally had to say, it looks like he's going to win it.
It's going to be it. So, again, there could be a dark horse, and no racial comment there, just the fact that that's the old phrase about a horse coming out of the pack and actually winning. And I suspect that somebody right now we haven't even mentioned, although I just don't think Julian Castro or anybody else is going to get there. But you never know, and that's why they actually have to have the primary. And as Dr. Merrill Matthews points out, we've got a debate coming up in about a month or two, and that's pretty amazing. So we'll come back, and we have a lot to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition, and we certainly do encourage your phone calls. In just a few minutes, we're probably going to spend some time talking about this new book by Dr. Merrill Matthews, America Faces the Entitlements Cliff, and we'll get into that. And I suspect many of you have some comments about Social Security, Medicare, and entitlements in general, so we'll certainly get into that. We're going to be talking about a case that was actually argued before the Supreme Court. We have some great material about everything from Equal Pay Day, the Electoral College, Joe Biden, presidential power, the census, all sorts of topics we're going to be addressing today. And in studio with us, Keisha Russel, who is the Associate Counsel with First Liberty, and Dr. Merrill Matthews, who is the Resident Scholar for the Institute for Policy Innovation. And these articles that we've posted are available on the website. But Keisha, let me come to you for just a minute, because there was a case argued before the Supreme Court this week, and you're a court watcher because, after all, you're a lawyer and an individual with First Liberty. And the argument that was made is that the Secretary of Commerce has the authority to determine what's on the census. Now, if I look at my Constitution, it says Article 1, Section 2 says that really Congress is in charge of the census. But you have a law that was passed a long time ago, long before you were born, but those of us old around the table remember this, which actually said that the Secretary of Commerce shall in such form and content as he may determine how to do this. And so the argument made by the Secretary of Commerce, appointed by Donald Trump, said, let's ask a question about citizenship. We used to, but we abandoned that back in the 1950s. But let's ask that question. Well, that created a lot of stir. Dr. Merrill Matthews, I'll come to you for just a second, because you know why it is. Because indeed, there's the argument that there would be fewer people that are here maybe illegally who would want to answer the census, which means you'd get an undercount. That would affect a lot of things. First of all, the amount of money that a state gets from the federal government.
Right.
The amount of representation, it could drop enough so that you would lose members in the House of Representatives. And then something we'll talk about later, you would even lose influence in the Electoral College because you'd have fewer representatives. So one of the reasons you can see why some of these states have brought a lawsuit.
And I don't think liberals are necessarily thinking this through, because you have, under the Supreme Court, requirements that you have certain majority districts that they when they draw the line, when they redistrict it. So let's say that you've got certain number of Hispanics in a certain area, so we know we have that. So we're going to make that 50% Hispanic, so that you sort of go up to what the Supreme Court wants you to do. But if a percentage of those can't vote because they're not here legally, you may have drawn one that sort of meets the Supreme Court test.
That's right.
But not actually be able to ensure that Hispanic person is elected there, because not all of them can actually vote. So you need to think through some of these things that you're supporting when you're wanting to make sure you don't have that citizenship question on there.
Well, a little bit later we'll get into that question, because there's some that are suggesting that if you're in prison, you could still vote. If you're a Boston terrorist, you're writing a commentary on that, I know.
Yes, indeed.
And
two states allow that.
Yeah, or also that if you are not a citizen, you could vote. So that's the case. But Keisha, let me come to you for just a minute. You are a court watcher, and I thought this piece by David French really made the case, because the argument that is being made right now is, when we had Bill Clinton in office, we had Barack Obama in office, we didn't have any problem at all giving the president and his staff and his cabinet authority. But we don't like Donald Trump, so the court needs to fix this. And I think the key argument that David French makes is the progressive or the liberal looks at the problem. He sees this as a problem, or if you think it's a problem, and demands the court fix the problem. The conservative looks at the same pattern and says, if you don't like the law, change it. And it seems to me that since we have a number of conservatives on the court, they're going to say, if you don't like the law that was passed back in, 1980, go change the law. But since you didn't, we're going to follow the law.
And hopefully that's, what the court decides, that they will interpret the law and not make the law, which is what is supposed to happen here. So I think that, even on the liberal side, if you're not a fan of this citizenship question, you have to really ask yourself, whose job is it to fix this problem? And in the end, it's really Congress's role.
One of the articles we've posted here is about this idea of presidential power, but I love David French. He's been in the studio with us before. This is the 3 times and you're out kind of thing, because he says first it happened with the Trump travel ban. Nobody had any problem with Barack Obama deciding who can travel and who cannot. Then it came with the national emergency declaration. Again, a lot of these individuals had no problem with Barack Obama or even George W. Bush being able to declare an emergency, but they didn't want Donald Trump to do it. And now here's the 3rd time with the issue of whether or not to ask whether or not you're a citizen on the census. And it says, Dr. Merrill Matthews, this is something we've been talking about for a long time, because what a lot of people tend to believe on the liberal side is what is sauce for the liberal goose is not sauce for the conservative gander. But that's not the way the game is played, right?
That's right. And Barack Obama decided he wanted to start using a lot more executive orders, and he did that in things we thought that should be left to Congress. You can't really pass a treaty by executive order, but you're doing that with China and with the Paris Treaty Agreement. So you sort of set the precedent. Donald Trump comes in and begins doing some of that, and oh no, you can't do this. These are powers that belong to Congress.
Yes. Well, and one of the pieces I've posted here is a piece by Senator Mike Lee, who we're going to have him on with his new book, because this was kind of a preview of his new book. But Senator Lee from Utah has made it very clear that now conservatives need to be thinking about this as well, because he has a scenario. What about a President, Kamala Harris, who then uses these executive orders to implement climate change? And so whether you're like who's in office or not, you have to look down the road. And there is a tendency sometimes for people to look at if their tribe, their member of their tribe is in the Oval Office, we've got no problem with that.
Yes.
But as soon as somebody from the other tribe or the other party's in the office, then they got a problem. You got to think down the road, don't you?
You absolutely do, because the day is going to come where it switches. And then when you set these bad precedents, it ends up coming back to bite you later on.
Well, if nothing else, I will make a prediction, and Keisha, you can tell me whether you agree, but when we talk about saying that if you don't like the law, change it, that sounds almost exactly like Neil Gorsuch. Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch said in a case recently. I'm pretty sure that Brett Kavanaugh seems to agree with that. So now we're down to John Rogers. I have a pretty good idea where Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito face. So this could be one of those 5-4 decisions, whether you think we should ask a citizenship question or not. I think the Supreme Court's going to rule that that's something within the purview of the Secretary of Commerce.
I think the main thing to really think about is what the topic is. And I think an originalist perspective would tell you that the court's job is to interpret, not make law. And even though depending upon the situation, a liberal view might say that that is not the way it should be. That is the way it's written. Yeah. And if you want to stick to that originalist perspective, then that's the ruling you have to make as a Supreme Court justice.
And I think this is just a good illustration of sometimes when we have these conversations about a view of a living constitution or an original interpretation, it comes down to something as fundamental as how, when you next year have to fill out the census, whether or not there's going to be a citizenship question on it.
That's right.
If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If not, just sit back, because we're going to talk a little bit about the entitlements cliff right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, funerals are starting to look very different. An article in the Washington Post predicts that the funerals as we know it is becoming a relic. And so many of our time-honored rituals are being set aside. You know, one of the first books I wrote was on the subject of death and dying. Back then, I noted that we were a death-denying culture. The elderly used to die in our homes, but now we're dying in hospitals and care facilities. And so we tried to cover the reality of death with euphemisms like, he passed on, or she's in a better place. Well, 4 decades later, we see that our secular society is changing the rules about dying. Americans are less likely to spend as much money on somber, embalmed body funerals. Cost is another part of the reason, which may also explain why more than half of all American deaths lead to cremations. This is nearly double the percentage less than 2 decades ago. Now, some of the changes in funerals parallel other changes in major life events. There are more destination weddings than just a few decades ago. Some of these gender reveal celebrations are becoming theatrical productions, so we shouldn't be surprised that some funerals look more like retirement parties or even birthday parties. Concern about the environment probably explains why many are opting for green funerals. The body is placed in a biodegradable coffin or shroud. One state has approved legislation that allows for human composting, and there are even businesses to turn one's ashes into vinyl or jewelry. Each generation tries to make its peace with the inevitability of death, and we are seeing new trends in that regard. As Christians, we can take comfort that we will be raised from the dead just as Christ was raised from the dead, and we know that death will be the final enemy to be destroyed. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, now playing.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Keisha Russel, Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, and want to spend a little bit of time talking about the economy. As a matter of fact, let's start with some good news, and then we're going to get to some bad news. The good news is 3.2% GDP. Dr. Merrill Matthews, nobody saw that as far as
blew everybody out of the water. Blew everybody out of the water. And then listening today to the various economists who were coming on explaining why they missed it so much. And so what they're saying is, well, what really happened is that inventories had been down, so businesses went and bought and increased their inventories over the past 2 or 3 months. So now that they've done that, we expect the economy to be maybe 2% for the next quarter. Never say die.
Never say die. You and I use a phrase that these are the economists that predicted 15 of the last 2 recessions.
Yes,
right?
indeed. Yes, indeed.
They just sow doom and gloom. Well, we're going to do some doom and gloom for just a minute. Sorry about that. But if you are receiving or will shortly in the mail, the May issue of the Outlook magazine, which we send to any of our donors, it's all about the national debt and also personal debt. Mm-hmm. And that relates very much to your new book, which is America Faces the Entitlement Cliff. And the bottom line is, very simply, we are not even talking about trying to reform entitlements.
No.
As a matter of fact, when we had Representative Van Taylor sitting in that chair just a few days ago, he points out that really the only place that Congress can do anything realistically is in so-called discretionary spending, which is a very small part about this. This is on autopilot. And when you talk about these entitlements, like Medicare and Social Security, they're just growing more and more, and you even haven't had all the baby boomers retire yet. So you've got some real crisis and a cliff, ultimately, that you're facing.
Yes, the Social Security trustees released their report earlier this week, and they do this annually.
Yes.
The good news is that the strong economy from 2018 has made the trust fund look a little bit better than it was, so that actually helped a little bit. And there's a lesson there. Good economies, strong economic growth, people going back to work, low unemployment rates actually helps the Social Security Trust Fund, but just a little bit, not enough to really fix it.
Right.
So the trustees say that beginning next year, 2020, that for the past few years, we've had more money coming in from Social Security than they actually pay out, because the money that you and I pay as our payroll tax goes in, and then Social Security turns around, takes that money right back out and hands it out to current retirees. But typically we've paid in more than has been going out, so there's a surplus. That surplus is about $2.9 trillion, according to the trustees. They say next year we're actually going to start paying out more than we're taking in.
Yeah.
So they have to start drawing on the trust fund, and that by 2034, there's two trust funds. When you put them together, it's 2035. But for the primary trust fund, the one we talk about when we think about seniors using it, 2034, it will be exhausted, and we'll have to start. There won't be any more money in the trust fund. They'll only be able to pay 75 cents on the dollar for every dollar the seniors listening to us expect to be receiving. However, that's if you believe there's really a trust fund.
Yes.
Because that $2.9 trillion in the trust fund, the federal government has borrowed all that money
IOU.
and put IOUs in its place. So before it can actually take the money in the trust fund to pay seniors, it's got to find that money someplace else. We don't have a pot of money anywhere, so it's either got to come from general tax revenue or they've got to go out and borrow it. So I would argue that the system is already broke, and is going to get even worse. The trustees, we're looking at trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities over several years out there. That is money that we're going to have to pay that is not coming in.
Well, again, Keisha's younger and looking at this saying,
fortunately, she wants to pay for you and me.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd be surprised
Keisha.
If there's anything left for me when it's time for me to pull anything out.
Not if Kerby and I have anything to say about it.
Well, and here, let's talk about this, because you and your co-author, I'll give credit for the fact that have been talking about this for some time. We've been talking about this for some time. And by the way, if you'd like to get a copy of the book, I've got a hardback that I'm holding up here. But we have a link, and it's all of 99 cents because you just want to get the information
Go to Kindle,
out.
and you can get it for 99 cents. Go to IPI.org, and you can download the PDF.
Yeah, so you can get it for free if you go to IPI, or you can get it on your Kindle and read it. And it really sets forth the case that you and I and others have been talking about. And let's go back even to the 1980s. Larry Burkett wrote a book called The Coming Economic Earthquake. Yeah. But they found some ways by increasing taxes and borrowing from the Social Security Trust Fund to keep it going. And, the picture you have here is a person about ready to go off the cliff. We haven't gone off the cliff yet, but, that gets pushed back more and more. And like you said, they could borrow more, but what else are you going to borrow at $22 trillion?
Yes.
My line is we're not broke. We're $22 trillion past broke.
Right.
So the only other thing we could do is start printing money, right? And that becomes what, inflation?
That becomes inflationary. And, of course, the Trump administration has not done much to help this. President Trump has talked about he wants to cut back the budgets. He's told various agencies up there you need to find a 5 or 10% cut in there to try to begin cutting that back. But anytime you start trying to cut the federal budget, you get umpteen people coming out saying, oh, no, you can't do that. You have to have all that money. You people are going to die in the streets unless we're spending money on this, that, or the other project.
Yes. And Keisha, that's part of the problem. I want our listeners to be at least wise consumers and wise citizens to say that when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders or some of the others that are either running for the presidency or already in Congress say, well, we just need to spend more money.
Mm-hmm.
You have
the
to
numbers
say,
just don't match that. And some of these policies are really just financially, I think, irresponsible in some ways. So I think it's really difficult to push these policies and also understand what's going on with the economy at the same time.
And one of the sad things is as we said, even last election cycle, neither Donald Trump nor Hillary Clinton was talking about this issue of entitlements. The few times anybody has tried to address that, think about the re-election of George W. Bush. He really traveled around the country for a while trying to talk about Social Security, and that went, is that fair to say, nowhere?
It went worse than nowhere. That was in 2005.
Yeah.
President Bush decided he wanted to try to push personal accounts, but he also at the same time was going out saying we're going to have to make some cuts in Social Security, we're going to have to maybe raise taxes. So he put those things up front, and then he sort of said, and by the way, we'll give you some personal accounts as well. But Democrats picked up on that, and they started, even though Bush was not going to cut any current seniors, it was going to be in the long out in the future. They always pick up on that and say, they're going to cut your Social Security. That creates all kinds of concerns. And as a result, you can't make any real headway on this. George Bush rolled out his Social Security reform in the worst way possible. And Republicans got beaten up badly over it. And so that was around 2005. 14 years later, we're still not having a discussion because they don't want to have that discussion because Democrats have been so good. In fact, and Democrats are actually going in the opposite direction. They want to create more entitlements. Yeah. Elizabeth Warren wants to come in and pay off all the student debt.
Here. Here. Now
I actually thought.
Now that is different. Okay, that is a different matter altogether.
This is a law school graduate.
I know that. Now that's different. We'll leave that one alone.
You owe Emory Law School.
Yeah, like the Green New Deal. That's totally different. Paying off student debt. That's for the betterment of the country. Okay, that's something we have to have.
She's having fun with it.
Just kidding.
Yeah, but again, that's kind of where we are right now. And are there any solutions? Because we've talked about a means test, or we've talked about capping benefits. Even if somebody was willing to get out there on a limb and have somebody cut it off behind them, what are their options? Are there any?
The trustees suggest that in order just to make the current system sound, you'd have to raise payroll taxes by 3 percentage points for Social Security. And that doesn't even count Medicare, which is even worse financial shape. But what Democrats are proposing is raising the cap on money that you have to pay for Social Security. The cap's about $133,000, right. So you don't pay Social Security FICA payroll taxes above that. They want to raise that, either raise it or eliminate it completely. And they also would consider perhaps bumping up the amount of money that you pay, the tax, especially for higher income people. But they also want to increase benefits right now. So, and I just counted. We've had 23 tax increases in Social Security since 1935. 23 tax increases. It has never been sound, financially sound. They always, when they raise the taxes, they always add more benefits or do other things, which end up meaning that in a few years you've got to come back and address the problem again.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 1930s, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt created Social Security, he had everything going for him because you had about 40 workers for every one recipient. Mm-hmm. You didn't receive benefits till the age of 65. I went back and found out the average age or median age was like 62 or something like that. People weren't living that long, but
right.
Now you have tens of thousands of centenarians.
Mm-hmm. Roughly 10,000 baby boomers retire a day these days.
Yeah, and you have all that. So you have people living much longer. You have more people retiring. And you don't have 4-1. You don't have 5-1. You don't have 3-1. You're pretty much almost at 2-1.
Mm-hmm.
So we're putting all this pressure on Keisha and all of her colleagues.
Thank you, Keisha.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. What can we do to address the entitlements crisis and cliff? Give us a call. We'll be back right after this.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your healthcare. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, it is our weekend edition, and we are privileged to have in studio with us today Keisha Russel, Merrill Matthews, and if you'd like to join us, and I'd love to hear from you, 1-800-351-1212. Are you convinced that Social Security is going to be there when you retire? Perhaps you've already retired and say, wait a minute, I paid into this, and so it is time for me to get Social Security and Medicare and those kinds of things. I'd love to get your comments, 1-800-351-1212. But as we were going to the break, of course, Keisha, one of the things you raised is, where does this money come from? And I thought I'd make the short list here, and this is a short list, but it's one that I put together on some of the Democratic issues. If you watch this week, they had 5 town hall meetings with some of the Democratic candidates, so we got a chance to hear what they think they want. And this is the short list: Medicare for all, which is single payer, Green New Deal, free college tuition, basically abortion until birth, where that one shows up a couple of times, a living wage of $15 an hour, minimum wage, government daycare. There was a debate back and forth whether to abolish ICE, so that one, but still someone abolished the Immigration and Customs Enforcement area, to eliminate private health insurance, and the Electoral College. We'll get to that later, Dr. Matthews. Voting age, to drop that to age 16.
Oh, God, no. Dear God. Dear God, don't do that.
And the filibuster, as well as pack the Supreme Court and reparations. That's a short list, but some of those
will get longer.
Yeah, and it's getting longer by the day.
And the bill will get longer, too.
I forgot Elizabeth Warren now wants to forget all the student loans.
Yes.
Of course,
Which I'm fine with this part.
Keisha's fine.
That I'm fine with.
But not dropping
she has
that
one
16.
good idea.
That's right. She's got one good idea. I'm fine with that one.
But how in the world, Dr. Merrill Matthews, you're going to pay for some of this? This is nuts.
Some of these, they would force it on the private sector. With Medicare for All, Bernie Sanders is going around saying, well, it's not actually going to cost us anything, because the leading proposals of how much a single-payer system would cost is about $33 trillion over 10 years, about $3.2 trillion a year. But we actually spend about that much on health care. So Bernie says once you make the thing much more efficient, whoever thought government health care was more efficient? Look at the VA. Once you make it more efficient and you get the profit out of there, and as you and I have talked about before, I've never seen there are for-profit insurers and not-for-profit insurers. There are for-profit hospitals and not-for-profit hospitals. I've never been able to find out that a for-profit hospital charges more than a not-for-profit hospital. As far as I can tell, they're roughly. I mean, they've may vary a little bit, but it's not
a market system,
right? It's a
somewhat.
market system.
Yeah.
So they want to get the profits out, but it doesn't seem to make a lot of difference with the profits in. And so they think they're going to be able to do this. And because they're going to pay doctors and hospitals less, they're going to be able to cover the roughly 25 or 30 million people who are uninsured right now. Now, the hospital systems came out just this week and said, my goodness, we're going to lose a lot of money under the Bernie plan. Insurers would lose a lot of money because you would completely eliminate private insurance from that plan.
Right.
So you would have some transfer of funds. People wouldn't necessarily be paying premiums. They want to tax people for. Bernie's very clear you're going to have to pay higher taxes, but he says you're not going to be paying health insurance premiums. So we'll see if that all comes out. But I don't think it's going to balance out, because we have almost all the major economies have some type of government-run health care plan. They do spend less, but it's not because they're more efficient. It's because the government says we're going to spend this much money on health care, and that's all we're going to spend on health care.
Which is scary.
Doesn't mean they're efficient. It just means they're setting the bar a lot lower, and then people in the margins, very young people, very old people, very sick people, they don't get as much care.
Well, and again, Keisha, that gets back to the issue of rationing. You're young and healthy, and so if you needed hip replacement, for sure. Take the old guys around the table here, and they might say, not so sure.
I already got mine replaced, so I'm good.
Yeah. See the point? Yeah, that's where it happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the rub, and I think everybody needs to consider the idea that the government will be able to decide what's worth paying for and what isn't. And if you look at some of the news stories about, the other countries that have this kind of health care, and they get to decide whether to keep your spouse or loved one on life support. I think that, to me, makes sense that we not do that.
And one of the most successful parts of Medicare is Medicare D, right? You know, and
Medicare Part D prescription
and
drugs.
The argument is, well, we have to take over that too because, Big Pharma, they're just ripping us off. So you can, if I looked at one of the bills, actually, if the pharmaceutical companies don't agree with what you are supposed to charge, they can pull your patent.
Right.
I can't even believe this.
Yes, that's the idea right now, and that actually goes on out there. It's called compulsory licensing in other countries. So if you're a developing country and you want a prescription drug and the drug company is not willing to sell that, there is this issue called compulsory licensing where they essentially just allow one of the generic manufacturers in the country to make it. But developed economies don't do that. But there are proposals out there, including from Democrats, to say if we're going, here's what we're going to offer the prescription drug company for its drug. If it's not willing to take that, we'll just compulsory license the patent. We'll take it and we'll just go ahead and send it off to a generic manufacturer to make it. That's what they call negotiations in this, and it's not negotiations, it's dictation. And I just point out, Medicare already dictates to doctors and to hospitals the prices that it's going to pay. They would put this essentially under prescription drugs under that as well.
If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Deborah, first of all, in Texas. Deborah, what's your point of view?
Hi. On all this wasteful spending, instead of them taking over, the government trying to take over everything, which they pretty much do now, we need like a round table to sit down and look at all the waste they do, like the shrimp treadmills and the silliness that they're doing, spending millions of dollars on stuff that's not necessary. Instead of worrying about taking people's insurance away and all this free stuff, just cut the budgets that way.
Yes. Tom Coburn used to give us a list of all these.
Yes, he did.
That's where the shrimp on the treadmill story comes from. You can't even make some of this stuff up.
No, but we spend taxpayer money on that. And the amazing thing is that they say that if we do this, the government's going to be spending so much less than what insurance companies do. Remember 20 years ago where we started seeing in the military hundreds of dollars for a hammer, a lot of money for a wrench and so forth because the government was in there paying for it. The government, when it steps in, does not necessarily, it may in some cases, but it doesn't necessarily get the best deal out there.
Yeah, that's for sure. And Keisha, when you think about that, we again recognize that the best place to get a good price and quality materials almost always, whether it's goods and services, is in a free market. And the problem right now is we don't have much of a free market in healthcare, and there are people running for the presidency on the Democratic side that want to have the government take over all of healthcare.
That's right. And I think, like I said, the danger of that, I think, is clear. And definitely, reducing the amount of choices that we have as consumers to choose the people who will provide the best care for us. I think you take that choice out of the American people's hands. I don't think that's a good idea at all.
Let me just give you an example. Under Medicare, several years ago, NPR ran a story. I had been writing about it at the time, about a man who was a senior who was on Medicare going to Johns Hopkins Hospital. He was losing sight in his right eye. The doctor said, we have a new machine here. We think we're about 90% sure we can fix your problem in your right eye. The senior said, let's go with it. He said, well, there's a problem. Medicare only pays $400 for that, and it costs us $800 to use the machine. He said, not a problem. I've got some money. I'll pay the difference. Can't do that. That's called balance billing. It's against the law.
Mm-hmm.
So he can't pay the difference between that. And the senior said, well, look, the Lord's blessed me. I'll just pay the whole $800. Cannot do that because of a 1996 law that passed. So the story closed out with the senior saying, I'm going to lose sight in my right eye. My doctor is 90% sure they can fix it, and I cannot do anything because I'm in Medicare and because of the payment structures in Medicare. I'm going to go blind because of that. That's where they left the story.
Yeah, that's where they left the story. And some people that have looked at, of course, there's two Medicare for all bills. One is Bernie Sanders, but the one in the House, we did some interviews a while back in which they said, if you think that you have a set of handcuffs on you in Medicare, just wait till you get Medicare for all.
Absolutely.
Because they don't let you go out of the system. Even in the UK, you can go out of the British health system,
right.
can't you?
About 10 or 12% of the people go out of the system and buy private health insurance. Under both of those those bills, you cannot go out and pay for something that Medicare would pay for.
Wow. We have to take a break, but I'll take some more phone calls, and perhaps some of you have some comments about everything from Medicare to entitlements. We're going to get into the election as well, because that kind of gets us into the announcement this week by Joe Biden, as well as the fact that Bernie Sanders just was down the road here, and, of course, Pete Buttigieg and some of the others have been saying some things. So we have a lot to cover, but let's take a break. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
The Washington Post reported this. A procession of clergy dressed in white carried a simple black cross through the streets of Ile-Saint-Louis on Friday, continuing a Good Friday ritual even while the charred hulk of Notre Dame Cathedral loomed behind them. Thousands of Parisians and visitors gathered for the Stations of the Cross devotion, a symbolic reenactment of Christ's Passion that commemorates the trajectory from his sentencing to his burial in 14 stops. Human beings are moved by stories, even more so when a story involves several of the senses. The world's greatest story is told as one walks the Stations of the Cross. For centuries, this story has also been told in the structure, the stained glass, the artwork, and yes, the relics at Notre Dame. Rod Dreher points out that cathedrals were poor people's books, because even the illiterate could be taught how to read the symbolism on the glass and the stones of the cathedral. Notre Dame receives 13 million visitors a year. I went there when I was 16. To me, it was another stop on a sightseeing tour of Paris. At that age, I knew very little and, if I'm honest, cared very little about the things of God. But inside, looking up, I was drawn to think about him. Years later, as a believer, I returned. In her Wall Street Journal column, Peggy Noonan expressed the sadness people of varying faiths felt seeing the cathedral burn. In her words, destroyed beauty is a spiritual event. She called a friend, Liz Lev, who is an art historian, an expert on Catholic art. When the fire came for 2 days, we let our guard down, Ms. Lev told Ms. Noonan. It showed us that beauty still affects people, that they know they are custodians. We still need to believe in the beautiful. As we invite Christ to write our story, he makes us more like him, more beautiful. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Also spend a little bit of time talking about some of those who have announced for the presidency, but at the moment we've got some good questions about everything from Medicare to Social Security. So let's go to Medicare first. In South Carolina, Adrian, thank you for calling today. What's your point of view?
I just have a question. I want to know if Medicare for All is for those that are under employer health plans.
Yeah, yes. The Medicare for All plans, it's a misnomer because it's not really Medicare. They eliminate Medicare as we know it and move to a single payer system, and it would include employers. So the roughly half of the country right now gets their health insurance through an employer, right. Workers and their dependents. Those would all have to go under the Medicare for All. So if you like your health insurance, you will not be able to keep it.
I love
my
that.
goodness.
Yeah, because of course, that's one of the things we heard before. If you like your doctor, keep your doctor. You like your plan, you get the doctor. But the bottom line is, as you've said in many of your commentaries, if you like your plan, you will not keep your plan.
Not under the Medicare for All as it's currently structured right now. Employer health insurance would go away.
Let's, if we can, for just a minute, we've said this just in passing, but it's really helpful if you look at the House bill, and I think it shows what is demanded. Everybody's got to be into the system. And in the British health system in England to this day, there are some people that can opt out of the system and go to a private doctor.
Right.
But under the law that's being proposed right now, and of course it doesn't have much of a chance to pass at the moment, if for no other reason we have a president that says this will never be a socialist country. But if it did under a President Kamala Harris or somebody like that, you would not be able to leave the system.
No.
Everybody would have to be in the system because that's the only way you could even possibly make the system
And
to
they
work.
could not pay for anything that is covered by the system. And that's the way it is in Canada. And I used to carry around a piece by a man named Greg Moulton in Guelph, who's just outside of Ontario. And an enterprising hospital had come up with doing CAT scans on pets after the hospital CAT scan machine shut down at like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So Greg had been diagnosed with these tremendous headaches, and he was in a 3-month waiting line for a CAT scan in Canada. 3-month waiting line. If he had been a dog, he could have it done that day for $300. And the newspaper quotes him as saying, I'd go anytime. I'd go at night when they're doing the CAT scans on dogs and cats, and I'd pay $300. But that was against the law for him to do that. And the New York Times, actually, a few years later, came out with a story where a man checked himself in after hours as Fido, called himself Fido, so that he could get a CAT scan and jump the line.
Yeah. Well, and this,
I mean, these are funny, but they're true stories.
Sad. Yeah.
Keisha, you just shaking your head, but I mean, I've heard these stories about this, just a guy going at the door going, woof, woof, just let me in because and that's the problem because, you constrain the system. The only way you can keep the cost down is by rationing. And sometimes it's not rationing, it's just long waiting lines where people just simply die.
I tell the story, Dr. Babechko, who was the leading orthopedic pediatric surgeon in the Hospital for Sick Children in Canada, largest children's hospital in the world. He was a leading orthopedic surgeon for children. He created what was called the Babechko clamp, which would, once put on spine surgery, you would get the kids out of the bed and out of the hospital in 3 or 4 days instead of 3 or 4 weeks as they were recovering. He thought this was going to be a great thing, but the hospital management called him in and criticized him because that was turning the bed over much more quickly than it would, which meant they'd have to do another surgery and another surgery, more surgeries, which was costing the hospital too much. It was going to be cheaper for them to keep the kids in the bed for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks rather than turning them over and getting them out in a few weeks.
That's incredible. Let's take some more phone calls here. We'll stay in South Carolina for another minute. Loretta, what is your question for us today?
I just wondered if God help us, we do get this socialized medicine, will it apply to everybody, including senators, congressmen, all of them?
When Bernie Sanders was asked that question on the Fox thing, he said, absolutely, everybody gets, it applies to everyone. And he got a round of applause for that. Remember, Obamacare was supposed to apply to everyone, and then once it passed, members of the House realized that they were going to, that because they got paid so much, they weren't going to get the subsidies from the federal employees benefits plan anymore, and so they went and Obama had his head of Office of Management and Budget go do some searching and came up with a thing saying, we have now discovered that Congress is a small business. And so because it's a small business, it will be able to go through what's called the SHOP Act, and they'll be able to get all their subsidies. So even though Chuck Grassley required them to he made that an issue, and they put in there, members of Congress have got to be subject to the same law as everybody else. Once it happened, they found an excuse to get out of it.
Oh. The article that we have here on personal debt gets into student loan debt. And one of our callers wanted to talk about this issue of student loan debt because it has become one of the biggest issues. And he had to go, but I thought I'd bring it up for him.
We have an expert in the studio.
Yes, we apparently do. And, student loan debt is the second highest consumer debt. There are more than 44 million borrowers who collectively owe $1.5 trillion in student loan debt.
I don't know that much.
And I know you don't.
I can assure you.
But the average college student loan debt is $37,000. But, of course, you've been to law school. Those of us who have been to graduate school know how quickly you can add a zero to some of that if you're not careful. It's just it's just absolutely mind-boggling. Mm-hmm. And my question, Keisha, is people like you who maybe don't necessarily have your view about this is my responsibility, but instead say, it's really helpful for the economy for me to have gone to college. So I agree. Senator Elizabeth Warren's got a good idea. We need to forgive student loan debt. What's the problem with that?
Creates an even bigger hole. I mean, that money was given out to you with the expectation that you would pay at least some of it back, because the money has to come from somewhere. It doesn't just come out of thin air. And so you have to have the responsibility I'm lucky that I have some friends who have student loan debt and they don't even, they don't even work in the areas in which they went to school. They don't even like those areas. Mm-hmm. It's almost as if they wasted, that money. I'm lucky that I am very grateful for my education, so I think it is my responsibility. But, I think either way, I think it's important that, everyone recognize that the money comes from somewhere, and you can't just expect the government to do it all.
One of the other callers, and since we're coming to a break, I'll just ask it for you. But Michael wanted to know, would you be able to pick a doctor under Medicare for All? And some yes, some no.
That's a good question, whether or not the doctors would participate in the Medicare for All. If there's no option outside, then you'd have to. Or if doctors decided for some reason they weren't going to do that, then I have long thought that the federal government, because the federal government pays a certain portion of doctors' bills through Medicare, the doctors' training, and I think you could find the federal government or the states coming up and saying, if you want to practice medicine in our states, you've got to be willing to take everybody who's in Medicare for All, because you can't have a system where the doctors go and not participate anymore.
That's right. And I looked at the House bill, and it seems to suggest that, because you have to sign some kind of disclaimers. And so that's going to look a little bit like, well, if you take one Medicare patient, you have to take all of them, that kind of stuff. So it certainly looks like it. And, of course, we know how the government wants everybody to be in the same system. So I think the answer would be obviously yes, that they would have to be in the system, but some doctors might still try to figure out a way to get around the system.
Yes.
But who knows whether they would. We need to take a break. When we come back, though, we have posted some articles on everything from equal pay day to the Electoral College. Joe Biden actually saying he's running because of the soul of America. We cannot allow Donald Trump to have 8 years, so we've got a lot more to cover. And we will do that with Keisha Russel and Dr. Merrill Matthews. We have links to First Liberty and the Institute for Policy Innovation on our website, including Dr. Merrill Matthews' book. We'll be right back.
This Easter, from 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment comes Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. When Joy Smith's son John falls through an icy Missouri lake, all hope seems lost. But a mother's belief in the power of prayer inspires her community to trust God to do the impossible.
Please, God, send your Holy Spirit to save my son.
Breakthrough, rated PG, parental guidance suggested. Now playing. Tickets and showtimes available at breakthroughmovie.com.
Ronald Reagan.
Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same.
What are you doing to pass on truth and freedom? As one step, have you joined Point of View Radio's Truth Team? If not, why not? Join today. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Keisha Russel, as well as Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us. We have a link to First Liberty Institute and the Institute for Policy Innovation. And I thought for just a minute we'd talk about Chick-fil-A. This is a story that kind of started in the state of Texas because of San Antonio. Mm-hmm. And then it went to a variety of other places, both in San Jose, California, and in Buffalo, New York. You have similar situations that have unfolded. Then, if that isn't bad enough, in one of these hockey games, there are people that jumped on the Zamboni because it had a thing about Chick-fil-A in there. And so it's just gotten crazy. Mm-hmm. Well, let me, if I can, for just a minute, come to you, Keisha, because I know you've been on Fox News and some others talking about this, because you at First Liberty said, wait a minute, San Antonio and the airport get all sorts of federal grants.
That's
and
right.
They're not supposed to discriminate. And so you have actually sent a letter to the Secretary of Labor, I believe it is.
Department of Transportation.
And Transportation,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
some of those about this whole issue of, are they in violation of federal law? Talk about that.
Well, yeah. So San Antonio City Council, by receiving grants from the federal government for the FAA, those are what the grants are under. In order to renovate their airport, they agree not to discriminate on the basis of religion. But even outside of those grants, okay, you still have this thing called the Constitution, okay? And the First Amendment requires that the government is not hostile to religion. It is neutral. And the city council banning Chick-fil-A because they're Christians that give to other Christians is hostility to religion and very much unconstitutional. So even outside of the federal grants, even though that's an issue too, their behavior is outright discrimination. I think the Supreme Court made it pretty clear in Masterpiece that, you know, that's just a core principle of the First Amendment.
Yeah, right.
You know, treating religious entities or people this way just because you don't like their beliefs is not something the government is allowed to do.
Well, and again, if you get into the other circumstances, let's go back 4 years ago. I wrote a commentary about the fact that in Denver, they wanted to prohibit Chick-fil-A to actually have a facility in the airport. Well, if you've ever flown through Denver, as I have, you say, that's where the longest line is. What happened? Well, it turns out that some of the lawyers with the Denver city actually sat down with the city council and said, now, if you actually do this, first of all, there is going to be a First Amendment case against you, and you will lose.
Absolutely, you'll lose. So will San Antonio.
And so what they finally said is, okay, we renege. So you would think that for sure in San Antonio, there would be some kind of cooler heads that would gather together, and I'll just read this.
And you would be wrong.
The San Antonio mayor and a majority of the council, when they reconsidered this previous decision, still voted 6-5.
Yes, they did. You know, one of the members actually said, once we make a decision, we should stick to it. Well, if it's wrong and it's illegal, you need to change it. You know, I mean, I think they're definitely opening themselves up. But I also think that one of the issues is that Chick-fil-A usually doesn't, you know, pursue these problems because they don't have to. You know, they're still a very, very successful chain. And for those who don't like Chick-fil-A, they're not going anywhere anytime soon. So please get used to it.
And I had my Chick-fil-A today, just to make
I
sure
have a
that
cup right in front of me of
There
Arnold
you go.
Palmer,
There you go.
Arnold Palmer from Chick-fil-A.
And to just be clear, it's not that say a gay person's walking up to the counter at Chick-fil-A and they're
Yes.
saying we're not going to serve you.
Absolutely.
They serve everybody.
Everybody. So it would seem that the only ones discriminating are the actual government officials who should know better here.
And so if people wanted to know more about that, there's a couple of action items. First of all, there is an election in May.
Yes.
And one or two of these individuals that voted the wrong way, since I'm going to bias the conversation here, are up for re-election, and they may not make it. So there's action item number one. Action item number two, for those in the state of Texas, there are actually a couple of bills. HB 3172, for example, which has been kind of called the Chick-fil-A religious freedom bill. It's not, but that's but there have been some attempts to actually pass some religious freedom bills. And then number three, and most importantly, if you click on the picture of Keisha Russel, and you will see that at the very top it has religious discrimination against Chick-fil-A we're investigating. You click on read more, and it has all of the information there, including if you would like to see the particular letter that you've written. And we also have you in front of Fox and Friends for 2.5 minutes, so people can watch you on television as well, right?
Yes, riveting footage, I have to tell you. You should definitely give that a look.
So again, it is all available at the website, firstliberty.org, or simply go to pointofview.net, and you can find out a little bit more. So there are a lot of action items. It could come from the federal government. It could come from the state legislature. But there's also an election taking place in May, and it could come from the voters of San Antonio. So we'll where that goes. But it is crazy because back to what you said just a minute ago, Dr. Merrill Matthews, it isn't that anybody's being discriminated. They do not discriminate on race, sexual orientation, religion, or anything in terms of who can actually obtain a Chick-fil-A sandwich. And it isn't necessarily because some of the founders or the people with Chick-fil-A have said that, although that's part of the issue. In many cases, they've been upset because Chick-fil-A, are you ready for this, supports the Salvation Army and the Fellowship of Christian
That's
Athletes.
Right. That's exactly what they said.
And you just say, you can't make this up, but this is what is the sticking point. Just talk about that.
What do you say on something like that?
Well, that's why I'm glad that she had 2.5 minutes worth of saying something.
Yeah, it's bad. I mean, you just think about the precedent that the government is setting here, not even legal precedent, but just the fact that it's showing, it's community members of San Antonio, the residents of Texas and the American people that this is how the government should behave towards a religion, and so it gives, authority to other people, other residents, other Americans to think that this is how you're supposed to treat religion just because you don't agree with someone's beliefs.
And the Salvation Army is one of the most inclusive groups. If you go into the Salvation Army store, it's inclusive. I mean, these are good organizations that people support because they do good work.
That's right. And Chick-fil-A, regardless of what you think about those organizations, Chick-fil-A is allowed to give to them. That is a right that they have, and not liking who they give to is not a good reason for the government to say no to them.
And again, my favorite line is turn it around. If all of a sudden we started saying, well, we're not going to go to certain establishments because they gave to LGBT or they participated in the gay pride parade, the scream would be almost deafening from the mainstream media. And yet this is allowed to take place. So if you want to educate some people about this, go to First Liberty, and you will find that that's the link. Now, there's a share button there, so you can actually take Keisha Russel's material, her video, and you could put it on your Facebook page or your Twitter account.
Is there a share button there?
There is a share button right there in the upper right-hand corner there.
I wasn't aware of the share button.
And that's a YouTube link, and so then you could actually post that, so you could have her make the case for you on your Facebook page or Twitter page, and I'll guarantee it'll start some conversation.
It's my pleasure to do it.
Yeah, so there you go. So I just wanted you to know about that, and that's one of the lead articles there at First Liberty, or you can find it, of course, a link at pointofview.net. We're going to take a break, and I'll take some phone calls. So if you'd like to join us, maybe you have some comments about Chick-fil-A or LGBT issues, that's fine, but also want to start looking ahead to Campaign 2020. We've had quite a number of candidates announced, more than 20 it looks like now. So we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, funerals are starting to look very different. An article in the Washington Post predicts that the funerals as we know it is becoming a relic. And so many of our time-honored rituals are being set aside. You know, one of the first books I wrote was on the subject of death and dying. Back then I noted that we were a death-denying culture. The elderly used to die in our homes, but now we're dying in hospitals and care facilities. And so we tried to cover the reality of death with euphemisms like, he passed on, or she's in a better place. Well, 4 decades later, we see that our secular society is changing the rules about dying. Americans are less likely to spend as much money on somber, embalmed body funerals. Cost is another part of the reason, which may also explain why more than half of all American deaths lead to cremations. This is nearly double the percentage less than 2 decades ago. Now, some of the changes in funerals parallel other changes in major life events. There are more destination weddings than just a few decades ago. Some of these gender reveal celebrations are becoming theatrical productions, so we shouldn't be surprised that some funerals look more like retirement parties or even birthday parties. Concern about the environment probably explains why many are opting for green funerals. The body is placed in a biodegradable coffin or shroud. One state has approved legislation that allows for human composting, and there are even businesses to turn one's ashes into vinyl or jewelry. Each generation tries to make its peace with the inevitability of death, and we are seeing new trends in that regard. As Christians, we can take comfort that we will be raised from the dead just as Christ was raised from the dead, and we know that death will be the final enemy to be destroyed. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, now playing.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Keisha Russel, Dr. Merrill Matthews. Let's go to, in this case, the state of Texas. Tom, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yes, sir. Thank you for allowing me to be on the program. About the government spending dilemma, it's not nice. It'll be real unpleasant to eventually deal with it. What I would think, try cutting everything by 25% and see what happens.
Well, first of all, you would hear these shouts from Washington all the way to the state of Texas, I suspect.
Well, you know, Tom, we'd be hearing it all over the world. But what is the alternative?
Remember back around 2011, wasn't it, when we did the sequester?
Yes.
The sequester actually did cut certain programs, and they went along with it for 2 or 3 years. The stock market started going up. I mean, things started improving a little bit, but there was just no chance they were going to allow that to continue going. So they started with the defense and other things, and they started edging it out, and essentially they just did away with the sequester, even though that was the first time there was actual cuts in federal spending. So, but several people have pointed out, if you just contain federal spending to around 1% growth per year, within about 10 years, the budget would actually be balanced. You wouldn't be necessarily drawing down the federal debt, but you would at least have a balanced budget just because the growth is so much more. But they can't seem to even contain it to 1% federal spending and growth.
Well, and you remember the penny plan, because that was the idea. If you could just cut 1 penny out of every dollar, then I think in 5 years you'd balance the budget or something like that. But and you said something in passing that we need to come back to. You've gone to Washington, D.C., perhaps more than anybody around the table, and you know as well as I do that only in Washington, D.C., when you have an increase, it's a cut. Because if you even cut the increase, you still get more money in the budget than you did last year. If you even reduce the increase, in Washington, D.C., that's called a cut.
It's called a cut.
Place where,
if you slow the rate of growth, it's called a cut. And Newt Gingrich is going to try to do that with Medicare back around 1995. He was going to try to slow the rate of growth of Medicare. And we said, they're critics are going to say you're trying to cut Medicare. No, we'll just go on television and show them that it's going to grow every year. We're just going to slow the rate of growth. Nobody paid any attention to that. Democrats in the media said he was cutting Medicare. Seniors got upset, and he had to back off on it.
Yeah, and of course you're pushing Grandma off the cliff on a wheelchair and all that, and we've been down that road as well. So it's just one of those real bizarre kinds of situations where only in Washington, D.C., when you actually have an increase in spending, it's still considered a cut. So
yes.
It is just nuts, but that is just another one of those topics. We'll certainly give you a chance to join. And just before we go on to the election, let's point out the fact that the revenue to the federal government is higher than it's ever been in the history of this country. So it isn't a problem of revenue because of the tax cuts. We just talked about the GDP going up dramatically, and we are generating more income to the federal treasuries than ever before.
Right.
Nevertheless, we still are running massive deficits. So it's not a revenue problem, it's a spending problem, right?
Isn't that always the problem?
It usually is.
It is a spending problem.
Yes.
And President Trump has said he wants to try to get control over it, but he will have an awful lot, virtually every Democrat and many Republicans who are going to fight him on that.
Well, and again, that's why we call it the cliff. And it's an entitlement cliff and a spending cliff. And again, just something to think of when people say we want the rich people to pay their fair share, whatever that fair share is, given the fact that most of it already is there. So nevertheless, that gets us into the election. And I'd love to, for just a minute, remind people that you might say, well, this is premature. No, Super Tuesday is March 3rd. And just think of these states which will all vote on that day: Alabama, Arkansas, California, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, and Virginia. A few days later, Louisiana actually votes. And then on the 10th, you have Idaho, Michigan, Mississippi, Missouri, North Dakota, Ohio, and Washington State. Okay, that tells me something right there. If you have not announced for the presidency, Joe Biden just did, it's too little, too late. And even if you have, and you don't have an enormous war chest, there's no way you're going to be able to compete in huge states like California and Texas. So does that give an advantage to certain individuals?
Well, it certainly does with name recognition, excuse me, like Kamala Harris. And we'll have to see what happens with Joe. The reports were that Joe wanted to make sure that he got nearly as much as Beto O'Rourke and Bernie Sanders did, both of whom got about $6 million within their first 24 hours. He felt that was a key factor, and I haven't heard any reports, but I'm guessing he didn't get anything near that.
Yes, and one of the questions here, can Biden beat Bernie? And this is kind of intriguing because I've said since the very beginning, Keisha, that it seems like this is kind of a woke primary where you've already had even some of the women that have been in one way or another dinged for this or that. Kamala Harris because she was a prosecutor, Elizabeth Warren because she was Pocahontas, and we can go down the long list. But I've also said I just didn't think that a white male would do well, but at the moment it looks like it's Biden and Bernie. It doesn't look like it's Beto, to use another B, and it doesn't look like Pete Buttigieg is going to be around for too long, but I don't know. It's kind of interesting to see what might transpire, and neither Dr. Merrill Matthews or I have any idea who the nominee will be. You got any thoughts?
Absolutely not. But I mean, I think the whole idea that, Joe Biden, and, I've heard criticism that Joe Biden may not be liberal enough for this whole woke, whatever that means. And I'm one of a believer that you should never choose, a president based on their race or gender. But, in this climate, with where the liberals are right now, it may not be enough to just be, President Obama's former vice president.
Yes.
Well, I would point out that Joe Biden, back in the 1988 presidential campaign, it was actually 1987, once he was in that campaign, it was discovered that he had copied about 5 or 6 pages from Neil Kinnock, who was the labor leader of England and a socialist. So if Joe Biden wants to have credentials for today, he can say, I was a socialist long before Bernie Sanders was.
I was quoting from
socialists 30 years ago.
I was plagiarizing a socialist. I know. But again, just think about this. I've said before, and certainly Colonel Alan West and others have said, he's always thought that Kamala Harris has a real opportunity. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that our listeners in California, all those of you in California right now, pay attention, get to vote on March 3rd. Mm-hmm. Now, I grew up in California where you vote in June, and it meant no different. By then, everything was already decided. But when you look at the enormous number of delegates that you can collect from California, add to that the enormous number of delegates you can pick up from Texas, and then we'll add in a few others like Massachusetts and a few other states, you are pretty much guaranteed that by the end of March 3rd, that night, you may have close to enough of the delegates to be the nominee.
Yeah,
and that means that if you're some of these lesser-known candidates, Julian Castro, you can go down the long list. I mean, it'll take me 10 minutes to go through the whole list. You're just simply not going to be able to do that unless you raise the money. And most of the time, if you have the money, you get the nomination. Howard Dean was the exception to the rule in modern time, but most of those individuals that have the money actually are the ones that win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Kamala Harris, I think she has a good shot based on this just because of her name recognition, the fact that a lot of people seem to like her, and her name is very well known at this point, and she's been able to sort of click with a lot of the liberals in the same ideology and supporting some of the things that they value.
And, I think I'd add in that there's going to be a large percentage of Democrats who want essentially somebody who can claim victimhood, who can say, I've been somehow beaten or downtrodden or something for years, and they're looking for that in the woke kind of primary.
Right.
Somebody who can claim that. So it's hard for Joe Biden to say that. It's hard for Bernie Sanders, though Bernie Sanders could say I was a socialist so long and everybody disagreed with me. So I think that's what a lot of them are looking for. And we saw that at the She the People.
And again, if you're a Kirsten Gillibrand, you're just
she's having
modern,
not getting any, and she's having
Cory
to go back
Booker.
and apologize for so much of what they had said in the past.
Yeah. And, you go down that long list of individuals that if you have to check all these boxes, that's going to be the case. When we come back, I want to talk about that a little bit more because the other boxes you have to check are all the issues we just talked about. We've only talked about Medicare for all, but are you a supporter of Green New Deal and reparations and those kinds of things? And the more out left you try to do each other in the primary, how does that play in mainstream and middle America? So we'll see. Let's take a break, though, and we'll come back and get some more comments. But, I'd like to get your comments as well. 1-800-351-1212. And if you would like to find out a little bit more about, for example, the Chick-fil-A issue we just talked about, that is available at First Liberty Institute. Also, we'll get into a couple of the pieces that we've posted by Dr. Merrill Matthews, which you can find at ipi.org, or they are also listed on our website, pointofview.net. Be right back.
Question: do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare. And they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Do want to talk about the election 2020 and also with the first article we've posted here by Dr. Merrill Matthews on the Electoral College. The two kind of go hand in hand. Keisha Russel with us as well. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And the first point I want to come back to is one that I gave you the short list, and it really is a short list, but everything from Medicare for All, Green New Deal, abortion till the moment of birth, which is just something that most Americans just reject, free college tuition and the abolishing ICE, government daycare, reparations, and on and on and on. Dr. Merrill Matthews, you've said before on this program that in order to get some attention with a pack of 20 different candidates, the only way you get some attention is by coming up with some other radical proposal. When I first made this list, reparations was not on the list. That gives you an illustration. When I made up this list a few days ago, it didn't have forgive student loan debt. So these lists get longer and longer. It's
and
a
more
way
expensive, actually.
Yeah,
And more
but
expensive.
it also gets attention. But I think the average American is just looking with askance at what this is going to look like for the election.
Right. The media has provided a feedback loop for liberals, and if you want to get any kind of attention, you've got to move further left than the other person. And when you do that, they come up, because Elizabeth Warren has come up with a wealth tax.
Yeah,
Alexandria
forgot to mention
Ocasio-Cortez has talked about a 70% tax on income. You come up with something like that, the media take this and they love this. The talk shows and the commentators will all discuss it and so forth, and then you get a lot of attention for it. And that's the only way you really get attention. Nobody's paying any attention to Amy Klobuchar. There's just so many of them that they just simply won't pay attention. If you're going to be moderate out there, you're not going to get any media coverage as a Democrat. And as a result, all the incentives are for you to come up with things that are more expensive and further to the left. And that, I think, is Donald Trump's greatest asset in going into 2020, is how far left the Democrats are likely to move.
If that goes further and further left, is it possible that somebody like a Howard Schultz, who says he might run as an independent, say there's got to be some space between Donald Trump, and it's funny to talk about Donald Trump on the right, but we will say that for the moment, and whoever from the left is there. But again, the possibility that if indeed Howard Schultz runs and mounts a campaign, does that not have the possibility of definitely guaranteeing a reelection of Donald Trump, just the way a number of years ago Al Gore suffered at the hands of a third-party candidate? What's your thoughts?
Oh, I think that's right. I don't think there won't be anybody in the there wouldn't be many Republicans who would vote for him. And conservatives, they would probably go and stick with Donald Trump, because Schultz is going to have liberal policies. He wants to try to make them at least business reasonable policies. So he may peel off some of the Democrats, and then you have a split decision on it.
Yeah, well, we saw what Ralph Nader did to Al Gore and what Ross Perot did to George W. Bush is a possibility. Again, that's a little less, but what about this, Keisha? These ideas, even, again, if you can look at it from a millennial's point of view for just a minute, I recognize you're different than maybe some of your peers, but still, okay, I might say, yes, I'd love to forgive student loan debt, and maybe it would be nice for my younger brother at the age of 16 to vote. But still, I just think a lot of them are just going to say some of these policies make no sense at a time when we are $22 trillion in debt.
Yeah, and I think, even if, in jest I say, I think you should forgive those student loans, which I don't actually think that. But what I'm saying is that, even in what you say, everyone trying to outleft one another, I think it's really, kind of excluding the people who don't at all believe these things, particularly for, some really charged issues like abortion, which we've shown in polls that the majority of the country, liberal or not, do not agree that you should be able to have an abortion all the way up to birth. But if the media only gives you attention when you're outrageous, then you really can't spout policies that actually make any real sense.
Yes.
And you're going to exclude most of middle America by doing that, I think.
Dr. Merrill Matthews, let's come to your piece here on the Electoral College protects all Americans against the tyranny of the majority, because the more I think about this, it is possible that we could have another election where the Democratic candidate, very liberal by definition, since we've already said that, could still end up winning the cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Philadelphia, maybe even Houston, whatever it might be, San Francisco, San Diego, Seattle, Denver, those kinds of things, and still lose the Electoral College because it's only representing the people sitting in the cities.
I think that's exactly where it is. We're increasingly moving to, it's not so much a left-right, but a rural-urban split in the electorate as they continually vote in the cities, and the cities seem to be getting bluer, the large cities, that is. And you'll have that little circle, that little enclave of blue votes, and the cities vote that way. The politicians run that way. But once you get outside the cities, it turns red fairly quickly. I mean, you go to Iowa, Des Moines blue, but and I think Iowa City may be because it's got the college in there, but outside of it, it's just almost all red. It's amazing how this has turned to a rural versus urban contest, and fortunately, we got the urban states are able to. And the rural states are able to still have an impact because of the Electoral College.
Well, again, speak to this because in your piece you talk about the fact that California has 55 electoral votes.
Right. And the largest population.
And the largest population. And Donald Trump recognized that I'm not running for the popular vote or the majority vote. I'm running for the Electoral College vote. So he didn't really go to California. He was from New York. And yet he didn't really go to New York occasionally just to raise some funds because he recognized that if you go to, as you point out, the 21 smallest states have a combined total of 92 electoral votes. So going to some of these smaller places around the country are more advantageous, and that was intended by the framers so that you weren't just representing people that lived at that time in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, or you weren't just representing the people in a big state like Virginia, but ignoring people in a small state like Rhode Island.
And because of that, the Democrats are proposing ending the Electoral College or trying to do a workaround so that they don't have to do it anymore. They lost... Typically, in almost all elections, I think there's been 4 historically, but since 1900, there's only been 2 elections where the presidential candidate got the losing candidate got more popular votes than the electoral votes. And that was in 2016, and which is why Democrats want to change this system. They think they need to do that in order to be able to get to win elections again.
Well, and again, one of the things, Keisha, that Dr. Matthews points out is that we have what is called the National Popular Vote Compact. And Connecticut's the most recent one to vote that in, that says that if indeed your particular state voted for a candidate, but he or she did not win the popular vote, we would send the electors that related to the person that won the popular vote. Now, it isn't implemented yet because you need, according to the compact, 270 electoral votes. I guess they have 184.
184
but
right
if
now.
you get a couple more states, we will have sort of a de facto popular vote. And if that's the case, that'd change everything, wouldn't it?
I think it would, because those big cities all of a sudden become very important at that point.
These are all blue states that have done that so far, but I believe Florida's considering it. I mean, some of the states are considering it, and we'll see if any of them adopt it. But if you had 2 or 3 larger states move that in, it would be this would no longer be a debate. We would have whoever won the majority of votes would win. And as we've pointed out, if Texas ends up going for one candidate, I would be upset if all our electors went for somebody else who won another state but didn't even do well in our state.
Yeah, well, even if you did, it implemented that in this state. Let's just hypothetically say it for a minute, that since Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, that in the state of Texas, they wouldn't send the electors for Donald Trump. They would send the electors for Hillary Clinton to Austin to vote. And then I'd say, my vote means absolutely nothing in the state of Texas or wherever it might be.
Yes.
So there's some real obvious problems with that, not the least of which is it's really an end run around the Electoral College. And it isn't going to happen, I don't think, between now and next year. But all you need is enough states that have that 90 electoral votes, and all of a sudden it's implemented, and that'd be really interesting.
Goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If you don't like the law or the Constitution, change the Constitution.
What a concept here. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I wanted to pick off your other piece here, the Equal Pay Day. Since we have a female here, if she can speak as to whether or not she's getting paid enough as the rest of the men around the table. And that was one that you have written about as well, and of course I wrote about that as well. So if you want to get into that issue, we will do so. And if you find yourself saying, boy, I'd like to read a little bit more about this, we have posted these various articles, some written by Dr. Merrill Matthews, one in particular by Senator Mike Lee, and a couple of others that are all available on our website, pointofview.net. And if you'd like to send around that video of Keisha, we've still got that link up there as well. And if you'd like to get a copy of Dr. Merrill Matthews' book, it's actually on Kindle, America Faces the Entitlement Cliff. So got all sorts of great material. We'll be back right after this.
The Washington Post reported this. A procession of clergy dressed in white carried a simple black cross through the streets of Ile-Saint-Louis on Friday, continuing a Good Friday ritual even while the charred hulk of Notre Dame Cathedral loomed behind them. Thousands of Parisians and visitors gathered for the Stations of the Cross devotion, a symbolic reenactment of Christ's Passion that commemorates the trajectory from his sentencing to his burial in 14 stops. Human beings are moved by stories, even more so when a story involves several of the senses. The world's greatest story is told as one walks the Stations of the Cross. For centuries, this story has also been told in the structure, the stained glass, the artwork, and yes, the relics at Notre Dame. Rod Dreher points out that cathedrals were poor people's books, because even the illiterate could be taught how to read the symbolism on the glass and the stones of the cathedral. Notre Dame receives 13 million visitors a year. I went there when I was 16. To me, it was another stop on a sightseeing tour of Paris. At that age, I knew very little and, if I'm honest, cared very little about the things of God. But inside, looking up, I was drawn to think about him. Years later, as a believer, I returned. In her Wall Street Journal column, Peggy Noonan expressed the sadness people of varying faiths felt seeing the cathedral burn. In her words, destroyed beauty is a spiritual event. She called a friend, Liz Lev, who is an art historian, an expert on Catholic art. When the fire came for 2 days, we let our guard down, Ms. Lev told Ms. Noonan. It showed us that beauty still affects people, that they know they are custodians. We still need to believe in the beautiful. As we invite Christ to write our story, he makes us more like him, more beautiful. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Keisha Russel and Merrill Matthews in studio with us. And I wanted to talk about your Equal Pay Day particular commentary. And if people are not familiar, this month was what's called Equal Pay Day. And the argument is since women earn so much less than men, they have to work all the way through 2018 and then all the way up to April of 2019 before they earn what men do. And, of course, you get all sorts of different numbers. I've heard some women now are saying, at least in some places, they get 81 cents for every dollar. But the bottom line is, Dr. Merrill Matthews is this is probably a good example of fake news or fake economics.
Fake economics, yes.
Explain.
Because what they're doing is they're taking government statistics, all women and they take a median income there, and all men and take a median income there. But it does nothing to say, do men have different jobs? Do they have higher paying jobs? Are they in different types of careers and professions? So as we've talked about in the past, males tend to go into engineering much more than females do. Females tend to go into education and social work and other things much more than males.
Doesn't pay nearly as much, I can tell you.
So if you put those two together, it's going to show a difference when you just aggregate all the incomes without sort of segmenting out. So when economists come out and say, okay, well, let's look at the lawyers out there and let's look at the medical doctors and so forth, almost all of that difference goes away when you do those types of things, look at people who are on career tracks as opposed to women who sometimes say, I want to have some more flexibility, or I'm going to take several years off to take care of the kids or things of that nature. So most of that difference goes away when you do that. But that does not stop mostly Democrats from trying to make a political issue of this as if there is a lot of unfairness out there.
Well, and again, part of it has to do with just the law, which says in 1963 you have an Equal Pay Act. In 1964 you have a Civil Rights Act. So if indeed someone does pay two individuals with the same seniority and the same kind of abilities different, then it goes to the EEOC, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, there's a claim there. If you can prove that that's what's going on, and it's pretty easy to prove it because your salary's on paper.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think if you're a lawyer, you're a doctor, you're a teacher, whatever it is, and you can prove, it's pretty easy to see whether that's the case or not. I think you're right that, women tend to choose different careers in different areas, and sometimes because men tend to gravitate towards the engineering and the mathematics and all of that, and those tend to be higher paying jobs, that sometimes that contributes to those numbers.
Some of that's changing too. More and more women are going into healthcare, especially medical doctors and so forth. So we may see that gap narrow over the years. In fact, it has narrowed over the past 20 years. And we may see it narrow even more as careers and choices change.
And we've talked about the difference in flexibility, seniority, and a variety of other things, but I wrote about the Equal Death Day because it appeared in Wall Street Journal, and I never really thought about this, but it's a study done by Mark Perry, and you and I know who he is. He's been on the program with us, American Enterprise Institute, in which he says the other issue is men tend to take more dangerous jobs. And let's just look at the 5 most dangerous jobs. The first is fishery workers, which is predominantly male. Number 2, lumberjacks. 98%. There are hardly very many lumberjills, mostly lumberjacks. Number 3, aircraft pilots. And you think, well, I've seen a number of women, but they're talking about all those that fly airplanes, and that's like 94% male. We've had hail here in the state of Texas right now. And matter of fact, I'm getting a new roof. And you and I both have put roofs on houses in Texas. Don't recommend it. 99% male. Hardly ever see a woman up there on those roofs. And then garbage collector is 88% male. So that's another factor I'd never really thought about. So in terms of choosing, dangerous jobs, sometimes that's the case. In terms of having flexibility, that's the case. But again, we're going to be hearing a lot about this in this campaign, Keisha. And if nothing else, it's just another place where you need to kind of raise your hand and say, well, wait a minute, there may be some very good reasons why there's a pay differential. It has nothing to do with sexual discrimination.
Well, and sometimes I think, on the Democrat side and even on the liberal side, there's a tendency to blur the differences between the sexes, and they're real, right? Men and women are going to choose different jobs sometimes. That's just the way it is. I'm not doing any of that stuff that you just mentioned. Okay, I'm not interested in being a lumberjack. None of that stuff. Okay. So, but that maybe is my own personal preference as a woman too. And I think sometimes it's hard to differentiate the fact that men and women are different.
And one of the things that you see is those people who don't go into college, if they're taking sort of blue collar jobs, men oftentimes, I've never had a female plumber come out. I've never had a female plumber. But if I had somebody from home care coming out, almost certainly would be a female. Right. Many times it's nurses. That's changing. More men are going into nursing, but it tends to be, if it's home care and so forth, tends to be women.
Well, just before we run out of time, let's talk about some of the things that are available at your website. First of all, Dr. Merrill Matthews, I've posted a couple of your articles there, but you have many more. So if people are interested in the book, there's a PDF there that they can get.
There's a PDF there, or they can go to Kindle and Get it
for 99 cents.
And they can go to Point of View website to find that, right?
We've got that link.
And plus, all of our studies and so forth are available free of charge on the website at ipi.org.
Yes, and again, not just what we've talked about today. We talked about Medicare, but you've become quite the expert on energy policy and things like that. So whether it's Medicare for All or Green New Deal, he's our go-to guy, right? He really has covered a lot of those. Now, Keisha, let's talk about First Liberty. Since Kelly's not here, first of all, we want people to be praying for the Bladensburg case.
That's
because this is still before the Supreme Court. And they say, well, you've already had the oral arguments. But this is where there's the back room kind of dealing.
That's right.
And that's why we need to pray. Talk about that.
The discussion is happening right now, between the justices about what they're going to do with this case. So it's very important that we stay in prayer and we get a very good decision on Bladensburg.
Well, and again, I know that if people find themselves maybe dealing with what seems to be a discrimination on religious issues, they can contact you, can't they? Because this is something, just a few weeks ago, we had Jeremy Dice on reminding us that the case about placing the Bible on the POWMI table came from a Point of View listener contacting you.
It did. And so any of your listeners, I think, just remember any sort of religious discrimination, doesn't matter how small, definitely contact us. Some people think we only do like these big Supreme Court type cases, but it's really the little guy we're out to fight for. So all of you listening out there, anything that happens with you or your relatives or friends, and there's religious discrimination involved, contact us at firstliberty.org and we'd be happy to help you.
One of the other things I wanted to mention is our booklet this month is on anti-Semitism. And you understand this more than anything else, that I've gone back and looked at the various hate crimes reporting, and almost all the hate crimes in America that have been reported are decreasing, with one exception.
That's right.
Against Jewish individuals. Now, you have been involved in a case in upstate New York for many years about this. So this is another issue that if you are aware of religious discrimination against your Jewish friends, you need to contact First Liberty, because you don't just support Christians. You
That's
support
right.
any religious
We do
group.
support any religion, and we do have a lot of cases where we represent a lot of Jewish organizations and people. So whatever your religion is, you can contact us if you experience any discrimination. FirstLiberty.org.
Yeah. Well, again, you've been on the various media circuits talking about some of the discrimination against our Jewish friends. So again, we need to support them. And just yesterday we had, matter of fact, we had Bunny Pounds in here talking about why Christians need to support Israel, why we need to support our Jewish friends. So I just thought I'd mention that because that's one of the cases you've been involved with.
Yes, very, very near and dear to my heart, that case in the village of Airmont, New York.
Yes. Well, that's all we have for today. But thank you both for giving us some time here on Point of View.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Let me just mention that if you find yourself saying, I really want to read this for myself, we do have those articles on the website. And matter of fact, I didn't mention, but Penedexter's commentary today is on the Cathedral Notre Dame, and I thought you might want to have that.
That's good. I read it.
And that is the case. We have, of course, links to ipi.org, firstliberty.org. It's all right there. And since we're talking about Jewish people, don't forget, we have a trip to Israel, and there's a banner there as well. Click Go to Israel with Kerby. And we would encourage you to join with us on that trip. I want to thank Doug for his help behind the scenes, as Steve as well. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your health care. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.